there, which I'm going to read about. It was an interview that I did with her, and she didn't know what to make of the experience until years later when she got engaged to somebody whose father worked for the fire department there and in Harford County, and confirmed that this house had existed. Or not that the house had existed, I'm getting my stories confused. The house definitely existed, that the murders had actually taken place in this house, and it wasn't just an urban legend. So I will read without further ado, except finding my page, so take a sip, talk amongst yourselves. Okay. On the surface, Bel Air is a town that doesn't seem to have a whole lot going on. It's pretty much a typical suburb with a small historic Main Street area and plenty of sprawling strip malls and shopping centers. From a fine selection of brand new cookie-cutter houses to a delightful variety of chain restaurants and home improvement stores, Bel Air offers up everything the perfect American family needs, never mind its dark past, filled with things that go on behind closed doors and the ghosts they create. This could be any suburb of Chicago, too. My friend Jen, who has shared several of her paranormal encounters for this book, came face to spectral face with evidence of the dark undercurrents of suburban life late one night along St. Mary's Church Road near Abingdon. She was driving home with a friend, approaching St. Mary's from Laurel Bush Road. It was very late, and they didn't expect to see anyone out. As they turned onto St. Mary's, their headlights panned across an empty abandoned house. There, standing at the edge of the road, was a young boy about 12 or 13 years old. He was staring off into the distance, almost like he was in a daze. They supposed he was waiting for someone, but as they went by, he didn't move or react to their car or its bright headlights. He didn't seem to notice them at all. According to Jen, if you were waiting for someone, you would look at the car passing, but he didn't. He was covered in blood and very dirty. His clothes were a mess. Jen and her friend were immediately shocked and horrified, but when they turned to look back at him, they didn't see him anymore. They were so unnerved they decided not to go back and to just keep driving. Jen still lives in the area and recalls that the house the boy was standing near had been empty for a while. Jen learned after the incident that the house had a hard time selling because potential buyers felt uncomfortable and scared by it. Her mother-in-law had actually gone to look at the house with a real estate agent before this incident and had a similar visceral reaction. She later heard what sounded much like an urban legend, symbolic of suburban unrest, that a murder-suicide had occurred in the house involving a father who shot his son and then himself. Jen had seen a blood-covered boy by the side of the road that night, and the house was never sold and was finally donated to the Abingdon Fire Department a few years after Jen's encounter. Jen and her family accompanied her father-in-law, a volunteer fireman, to watch it burn down. She was reminded of her disturbing experience that night and hopes the boy has finally found peace. And she actually sent me a picture of her daughter standing in front of the house while they were burning it. So I can pass this around if you want. It's on page 47. That's one of my favorite stories from the book, even though it's really brief, because you hear, like I said, so many of these urban legends and so many of the things that sound like they're made up about these wild and crazy murders that take place on these back roads and these houses that are, to the wayside, and, it's likely that this actually happened. So let me grab another copy of the book. So another one of my interests with storytelling are stories that don't fit neatly into paranormal categories. So there's ghosts, there's UFOs, and then there's other things. And I got really cool stories while I was doing my research. In general, people send me cool stories and photos and all sorts of things. Actually, I'll do a quick shameless plug. There's the Dr. Mudd house that's featured in the story. And Dr. Mudd, he was the doctor that he helped John Wilkes Booth after the Lincoln assassination. So John Wilkes Booth ended up at his house, and he ended up setting his broken ankle. And he was later convicted in the conspiracy, but then pardoned. but his house is now open for tours, and it's also supposed to be haunted. And these ladies sent me this incredibly creepy photo. So people send me ghost photos a lot, and I'm always like, it's gonna be it's gonna be an orb, or it's gonna be some tree that looks like a face or something. But this one was unprecedented, and it's in there. And then it was also featured on my ghost story. So they told the same story on my ghost story, and that was on there. So I don't know if you guys saw that. It was episode 59, if that means anything for Googling it. But anyway, I got cool pictures, I got cool evidence, and I got really neat stories. And my uncle sent me some crazy stories about creatures and different things that he's encountered. And he also sent me a doppelganger story, which I've always been fascinated by doppelgangers and that phenomenon. And I wish I had, one of my favorite is actually the Black Eyed Kids, and I didn't have anybody submit a Black Eyed Kids story. That would have been super awesome, but I don't know if they're seen frequently in Maryland, so I'm going to have to change that. But so I'm going to read his doppelganger story. Heaven forbid I mark my pages before I get here. Okay. And this happened close to Washington, D.C. So I know that it's hard to, if you haven't been to Maryland, it's probably hard to visualize. Maryland has like a varied landscape, but it's very similar to Illinois in most places, and then Western Maryland has the mountains, and then the Eastern Shore is obviously beachy, with lots of estuaries and things. But obviously near Washington, D.C., it's pretty suburban. The German word doppelganger refers to someone who is the look-alike of another person, literally double walker. Paranormally speaking, a doppelganger encounter involves seeing or interacting with an entity that appears to us as someone we know and sometimes ourselves. Doppelgangers are rarely seen, while their living human counterparts are also present, causing an encounter with one to range from mildly confusing and seemingly without purpose to completely terrifying. This is an especially interesting paranormal phenomenon because it doesn't fit neatly into the ghost category. I've heard quite a few interesting stories about doppelgangers. One lady told me that she and her mother were sitting in her kitchen one day when her husband came and sat down with them and conversed normally with them for several minutes. Suddenly, the lady turned around and saw her husband come through the doorway to the kitchen. She and her mother looked back at where he had just been sitting and found that his chair was empty. My uncle Bernie sent me 2 letters detailing his doppelganger experiences, one as an adult and one as a child. As an adult, he remembers sitting upstairs one day waiting for his wife, my Aunt Deborah, to bring up some tea and snacks, because they're like that. He clearly recalls seeing her come up the stairs with a tray of goodies and turn and walk into another room. He was about to get up and look for her when about 20 seconds later, the real Deborah came up the stairs with the same tray and asked him why he had such a puzzled look on his face. Neither of the above incidences happened in Maryland, but the one below did. This is my Uncle Bernie's childhood doppelganger encounter, which happened when he was 6 in the summer of 1953. And this is in his words. My sister Patty, 3 years old at the time, and I were playing hide and seek inside the house. Mom had brought us in from outside because it was extremely hot and our house was nice and cool. This was before air conditioning. Patty was supposed to count to 10 in her bedroom if she could and then try and find me. I hid in the kitchen behind a tall trash can at the end of the kitchen counter. I had a good view into the dining room and living room. Suddenly I saw what appeared to be my sister Patty coming from the living room into the dining room and hide under the dining room table and chairs. I left my hiding place and as quietly as I could crept to the dining room entrance from the kitchen to try and scare her. She was not there. I could still hear her counting out loud in her bedroom. I couldn't believe it. Mom was in the basement ironing clothes at the time, and I told her I was afraid of what I'd just seen, but she passed it off as peeping out in the sun for too long. That incident was imprinted on me, and I actually had feelings of a presence in our home until the day we moved. Has anybody here had a doppelganger encounter or something that they would sort of, you don't have to tell it, but I'm just curious if anybody has or thinks they have. Okay. So I have a couple more stories that I want to talk with you guys about, but I figured this will be a good time to tell you about Bigfoot, because so Breakfast with Bigfoot is also based on an actual incident, a report of an incident with Bigfoot that I read about 6 or 7 years ago, and built, a cute little children's story around. But so it's interesting because a lot of Bigfoot stories end up, even though the people are afraid when they encounter Bigfoot, they end up feeling like he was benevolent in some way, that the Bigfoot, he or she was looking out for them or trying to protect them, even if it was like frightening. And so this was one of those stories where, and not even a story, it was an actual incident report, I think, on the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization website, and they're the Finding Bigfoot people. But they have like their whole database, and so I found this story where this man said that he had been lost in the woods, and it was a cold night, and he decided that it was best for him to hunker down, and he fell asleep. I keep kissing the microphone. He fell asleep, and when he woke up, he was being carried through the woods and watching the ground sort of swing back and forth in front of him, and realized that something large was carrying him by his backpack. And so he was, of course, terrified when he realized that it was a Bigfoot. And this Bigfoot carried him all the way back to its nest, just like a large nest of branches and pine needles and things like that on the ground, which have been found in other cases too. And Bigfoot put him down in the nest, and I guess they had like a fairly, sleepless night, and the guy finally fell asleep. He's exhausted from having this stare down with Bigfoot all night, I guess, because Bigfoot didn't do anything to him. And so he woke up in the morning, and I think the Bigfoot was either gone, or it sort of, it was there, but it was doing its own Bigfoot thing, and he left. And he felt that this Bigfoot was protecting him, that he put him in his nest for a reason. He obviously let him go. And he was very touched by the experience. So I said, this is a great kid's story. And so I turned the, middle-aged dude that this happened to into like a 5-year-old girl and wrote the story that, the next day they got up and had a lovely breakfast together. And the point is really for kids to know what they should and shouldn't eat if they're out in the woods.